The September rain drummed against the funeral home windows like impatient fingers, each drop catching the muted light from the stained glass panels that cast amber shadows across the burgundy carpet. I stood beside Dad's casket in my best Navy suit, the one Margaret had helped me pick out 3 years ago when we thought we'd need it for job interviews instead of goodbyes. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, mingling with that peculiar funeral home smell of wood polish and something else I could never quite name, something that seemed to whisper of endings. "He looks peaceful, doesn't he, Robert?" My sister Patricia's voice carried that practiced gentleness she'd perfected during her 23 years as a hospice nurse in Cedar Rapids. Her graying auburn hair was pulled back in the same careful bun she'd worn to every family gathering since Mom passed 12 years ago. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her black dress, the same one she'd worn to both our mother's service and our Aunt Dorothy's last spring. I nodded, though peaceful wasn't quite the word I'd choose for Dad's expression. Even in death, Harold Mitchell looked like a man who'd been keeping secrets. The undertaker had done his best, but nothing could soften those deep lines around Dad's eyes, lines that had deepened considerably in his final months when he'd started talking about things that made no sense. Mirrors that moved on their own, reflections that didn't match reality, voices that called his name from empty rooms. We'd all assumed it was the beginning of dementia. Dr. Henderson at the county clinic had been gentle but firm. Early-stage Alzheimer's was common in men Dad's age, especially those who'd spent 42 years breathing in chemicals at the grain elevator. The mind plays tricks when it starts to deteriorate, he'd explained, recommending we remove any confusing elements from Dad's environment. Perhaps it was time to consider assisted living, somewhere with proper supervision and medical care. But Dad had been adamant about staying in the old farmhouse on Elm Creek Road, the same 2-story white clapboard structure where he'd brought Mom as a newlywed in 1961. He'd rather die in his own bed than waste away in some sterile facility, he'd said, and we'd respected that wish. Patricia had arranged for a home health aide 3 times a week, and I'd driven out from Des Moines every Sunday to check on him to make sure he was eating properly and taking his medications. The visitation line stretched longer than I'd expected for a Tuesday afternoon. Dad had lived his entire 78 years in Fairfield, Iowa, working at the same job, attending the same Methodist church, shopping at the same handful of businesses on the town square. People remembered Harold Mitchell as a steady man, reliable as sunrise, someone who'd lend you his truck if yours broke down or help you move furniture without being asked twice. They came to pay their respects in the way small-town folks do, bringing casseroles and awkward hugs, sharing stories about Dad's kindness that made my chest tight with grief. Mrs. Kowalski from the house next door approached with her characteristic shuffle, her aluminum walker clicking against the carpet. At 91, she was one of the few people left who remembered Dad as a young man, fresh out of high school and full of dreams about farming his grandfather's land before the agricultural crisis of the 80s changed everything. "Your father was a good neighbor, Robert," she said, her voice paper-thin but warm. "Even these last few months when he was troubled, he still brought my mail up from the road when the weather was bad." She paused, glancing toward Patricia, then back to me. "Those mirrors he was always talking about. I hope you boys know what to do with them." Harold seemed mighty concerned about those mirrors. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, though I couldn't have explained why. Dad had indeed become obsessed with mirrors in his final months, not just talking about them, but covering them with sheets, turning them to face the walls, muttering about things that shouldn't be there. We'd thought it was another symptom of his deteriorating mental state, a fixation that would pass like his previous concerns about locked doors and strangers in the yard. Patricia's hand found my arm, her touch gentle but warning. We'd agreed not to encourage the strange talk about mirrors and supernatural nonsense. It only seemed to agitate him more when we engaged with his delusions, Dr. Henderson had advised. Better to redirect, to focus on reality, to maintain a calm and rational environment. But Mrs. Kowalski's words stirred something uneasy in my memory. Last Sunday, when I'd visited Dad for what would turn out to be the final time, he'd grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and pulled me close to his bed. His blue eyes, still sharp despite everything else fading, had burned with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "The mirrors, Bobby," he'd whispered, using the childhood nickname he hadn't called me in decades. "When I'm gone, you need to understand about the mirrors. Don't let Patricia handle them alone. The collection upstairs. It's not what she thinks. It's not what anyone thinks. I'd assumed it was the medication talking, or the confusion that had been growing stronger each week. Dad had started collecting antique mirrors about 5 years ago, after Mom died. He'd said they reminded him of her, that she'd always loved beautiful things. The collection had grown until the upstairs guest bedroom looked like a maze of reflected light, Victorian hand mirrors, ornate wall pieces, Art Deco vanities, even a few modern pieces that caught his eye at estate sales and antique shops. Patricia had rolled her eyes whenever he brought home another mirror. Dad's new hobby, she'd call it, with the indulgent tone she used for harmless eccentricities. She'd already mentioned wanting to sell the collection after the funeral, said they'd bring good money and help settle Dad's modest debts. Estate sale companies loved antique mirrors, especially ones in good condition. Now, standing in the funeral home with Mrs. Kowalski's worried words echoing in my mind, I wondered if I should have paid more attention to Dad's urgent whispers about his collection. The rational part of my mind, the part that balanced budgets and managed a small accounting firm, insisted there was nothing mysterious about a grieving widower collecting beautiful objects. But something deeper, something that remembered being 7 years old and believing in monsters under the bed, whispered that maybe Dad hadn't been as confused as we'd thought. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The truth about Dad's collection was waiting. And somehow I knew that whatever I found there would be far more complicated than a simple inheritance. The drive to Dad's farmhouse took 23 minutes through Iowa corn country, past fields stubbled with September harvest and farmsteads that glowed amber in the setting sun. I'd made this journey every Sunday for the past 2 years, watching Dad's health decline with the same steady inevitability as the changing seasons. The white clapboard house sat back from Elm Creek Road, surrounded by the oak trees he and Mom had planted as newlyweds, their leaves just beginning to turn the russet and gold that would carpet the yard by October. Inside, the house felt hollow without Dad's presence. His coffee cup still sat in the kitchen sink, half full of the bitter brew he'd favored since his army days in Vietnam. The prescription bottles lined the counter like tiny soldiers, medications for blood pressure, cholesterol, the arthritis that had gnarled his carpenter's hands into permanent claws. I'd helped him organize these pills into weekly dispensers, watched him struggle with child-proof caps that seemed designed to frustrate the elderly. The mirror collection had started innocently enough. 3 months after Mom's funeral, I'd found Dad at an estate sale on the outskirts of town, holding a silver-backed hand mirror with intricate rose patterns etched into the handle. "Your mother would have loved this," he'd said, running his thumb across the smooth surface. She always said mirrors captured beauty, made it last forever. He'd paid $30 for that first piece, carrying it home like a sacred relic. What followed was 2 years of weekend antiquing that bewildered our small family. Dad, who'd never shown interest in decorative objects beyond Mom's china cabinet, began haunting estate sales and antique shops with the dedication of a true collector. He'd call me at the office, voice animated in a way I hadn't heard since Mom's death. "Bobby, you should see this Victorian vanity mirror I found. The seller said it came from a mansion in Burlington. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." Patricia had initially been pleased. "At least he's getting out of the house," she'd told me over coffee at Mabel's diner downtown. "Better than sitting in that recliner all day, staring at the walls." We'd thought the mirrors might fill some of the emptiness Mom's absence had created, give him purpose during retirement years that stretched ahead with no clear direction. I remembered the Sunday afternoon when Dad had shown me his growing collection for the first time. He'd led me upstairs to the guest bedroom like a proud curator unveiling a new exhibit, his weathered face bright with enthusiasm. "Look at this one, Bobby," he'd said, pointing to an ornate oval mirror with a gilt frame. "It's from the 1890s. The woman who sold it said it belonged to her grandmother, came all the way from Philadelphia when the family moved west." The room had been transformed into something magical that day. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the west-facing window, bouncing between the mirrors in a dance of golden light that made the space feel larger than its actual dimensions. Dad had arranged each piece carefully, considering angles and reflections, creating what he called conversations between the mirrors. Some hung on walls, others stood propped against the dresser or windowsill, each one catching and throwing light in its own unique way. "Your mother always said mirrors were windows to beauty," Dad had explained, adjusting the angle of a hand mirror with mother-of-pearl inlay. She'd spend hours in front of her vanity, not out of vanity, mind you, but because she said mirrors showed her the best version of herself. They helped her remember who she was when the world tried to make her feel small. I'd found his passion touching then, a healthy way to honor Mom's memory while giving structure to his days. He'd research each piece meticulously, learning about its origins, its previous owners, the craftsman who'd created it. His knowledge became encyclopedic. He could tell you the difference between mercury-backed mirrors and modern silvered glass, could identify the telltale signs of authentic Victorian pieces versus reproduction work. But something had changed about 8 months ago. Dad's enthusiasm had begun to carry an undercurrent of anxiety that I couldn't quite understand. He'd started calling me at odd hours, asking strange questions about the mirrors' histories, their previous owners, whether I thought objects could hold memories the way photographs preserved images. "I've been researching the pieces more deeply," he'd told me during one of these late-night calls, his voice carrying an edge I didn't recognize. "Some of these mirrors have interesting pasts, Bobby. The oval one with the gilt frame. It came from the Whitmore estate. You remember hearing about that family? 3 generations of women, each one found dead in front of that very mirror. I'd chalked it up to the morbid fascination elderly people sometimes developed, the way they began reading obituaries first and dwelling on old tragedies. Dad had always enjoyed local history, knew stories about every family in Fairfield going back 4 generations. It seemed natural that he'd want to learn about his antique's provenance, even if his research led him down darker paths than expected. The changes had become more pronounced over the winter months. Dad had started covering some mirrors with sheets, muttering about reflections that didn't look quite right. He'd rearranged the collection multiple times, claiming certain pieces didn't get along when placed too close together. Patricia and I had exchanged concerned glances during family dinners, watching this man who'd always been the steadiest person we knew become increasingly agitated about his beloved collection. "Maybe we should suggest he sell a few pieces," Patricia had whispered to me after one particularly unsettling visit. "The collection is getting too large for that room, and he seems overwhelmed by maintaining it all." But Dad had overheard our quiet conversation and reacted with unexpected vehemence. "Those mirrors aren't just objects," he'd said, his voice sharp in a way that made us both step back. "They're connected to something important. Your mother. She understood. She tried to warn me before she died, but I didn't listen. I thought it was just the morphine talking." Now, standing in his empty kitchen with the weight of his final words pressing against my memory, I realized how little attention we'd paid to Dad's growing distress. We'd been so focused on his physical health, the medications, the doctor appointments, the practical concerns of aging, that we'd dismissed his emotional and mental struggles as inevitable symptoms of decline rather than genuine attempts to communicate something important. The house creaked around me as I climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom that had become Dad's display room. The narrow hallway felt different in the evening light, shadows pooling in corners that seemed perfectly normal during my Sunday visits. Dad had always kept this upstairs area meticulously clean, another change since Mom's death. She'd been the housekeeper in their marriage. Dad had learned to maintain her standards out of respect and necessity. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and I could see fragments of reflected light dancing across the hallway wall, the collection catching the last rays of sunlight streaming through the west-facing window. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, and for a moment I felt like a child again, afraid of what might be waiting in the darkness beyond. When I pushed the door open, the sight took my breath away. The collection had grown significantly since my last proper look at it 6 months ago. What had once been an orderly display of beautiful antiques now resembled something more intense, more deliberate. Mirrors of every size and style covered nearly every available surface, hanging from walls, propped against furniture, balanced on makeshift stands Dad had constructed from old wooden crates. The late afternoon sun created a kaleidoscope effect, light bouncing between the mirrors in complex patterns that made my eyes water if I stared too long. But there was something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Several of the mirrors had been turned to face the walls, their reflective surfaces hidden like covered paintings in a museum storage room. Others were draped with white sheets that stirred slightly in the breeze from the heating vent, giving them the appearance of ghosts frozen mid-dance. I approached the large oval mirror Dad had mentioned during his research phase, the one from the Whitmore estate. Its gilt frame was more elaborate than I'd remembered, with carved roses and thorny vines that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. The mirror itself was old enough that the silvering had begun to deteriorate at the edges, creating dark spots and cloudy areas that gave reflections an antiquated dreamlike quality. Standing in front of it, I studied my own reflection and felt an odd discomfort settle in my chest. The mirror showed me clearly enough, a 52-year-old accountant with thinning brown hair and the soft middle that came from too many years behind a desk. But there was something about the quality of the reflection that seemed wrong. Not dramatically so, just subtly off in a way that made me want to look away. I moved to examine some of the covered mirrors, lifting sheets to peek at the hidden surfaces. Each one was beautiful in its own right. A Victorian hand mirror with silver backing, an Art Deco vanity piece with geometric patterns, a simple round mirror that might have come from a 1940s bedroom set. But as I looked at each reflection, that same uncomfortable feeling grew stronger. Nothing I could point to specifically, just an impression that the reflections were somehow delayed, like watching myself on a video call with poor internet connection. The rational part of my mind dismissed these sensations as products of grief and stress. I'd buried my father that morning, spent hours shaking hands and accepting condolences, dealing with the emotional exhaustion that comes with loss. Of course, everything would feel strange and unsettling. Of course, an elderly man's eccentric collection would seem more mysterious after his death, especially when he'd spent his final months talking about supernatural concerns. But then I noticed Dad's research materials scattered across the old writing desk in the corner. File folders, newspaper clippings, printouts from genealogy websites, all organized with the same meticulous care he'd brought to his tax records and household accounts. I opened the folder marked Whitmore Estate and found myself reading a disturbing pattern of information. Margaret Whitmore, age 34, found dead in her bedroom in 1923. Natural causes, the death certificate stated, though the family doctor noted she'd been found seated at her vanity, staring into the large oval mirror. Her daughter Catherine had discovered the body and reported that her mother's expression was one of absolute terror, though no evidence of foul play was discovered. Catherine Whitmore Collins, age 41, found dead in 1954. Again, natural causes. Again seated at the same vanity mirror in what was now her childhood bedroom. Her teenage son reported that his mother had been acting strangely for weeks before her death, claiming she saw movement in mirrors when no one else was present. Elizabeth Collins Morrison, age 38, found dead in 1979. The pattern held, natural causes, the same mirror, the same expression of terror frozen on her face. The police report mentioned that neighbors had complained about lights flickering on and off in the house's upper rooms for several nights before the body was discovered. I set the folder down with hands that had begun to shake slightly. Dad's research was thorough and well documented, but it proved nothing beyond a series of unfortunate coincidences. 3 women from 3 generations dying of natural causes wasn't supernatural. It was genetics, family health history, the kind of patterns that run through bloodlines like eye color or height. Still, I found myself backing away from the Whitmore mirror, moving instead to examine some of the other pieces Dad had researched. The folders revealed similar stories, not as dramatic as the Whitmore deaths, but consistent themes of previous owners reporting strange experiences. Reflections that moved independently. Voices heard from empty rooms, sleep disturbances, and vivid nightmares that began after acquiring certain mirrors. The sun was setting now, and the room's atmosphere was shifting as shadows lengthened and the dance of reflected light became more subdued. I reached for the light switch, but when the overhead bulb flickered on, the mirror reflections seemed to multiply and intensify in a way that made the room feel crowded despite my solitary presence. That's when I heard it. A sound so soft I almost missed it. Like someone calling my name from very far away, the voice muffled as if coming through water or thick glass. I froze, listening, but heard only the familiar sounds of the old house settling and the wind picking up outside. I was letting my imagination run wild, influenced by Dad's research and the emotional weight of the day. But as I turned to leave the room, something made me glance back at the Whitmore mirror one final time. My reflection looked normal enough, but just for a moment, so briefly I couldn't be sure it had happened at all. I thought I saw movement in the darkened corners of the reflected room. Shadows that didn't correspond to anything in the actual space around me. I switched off the light and closed the door firmly behind me, but the unsettled feeling followed me downstairs like a persistent cold draft. In the kitchen, I made coffee with Dad's old percolator and tried to organize my thoughts rationally. I needed to call Patricia in the morning, discuss practical matters like the estate sale and cleaning out the house. The mirror collection would need to be properly appraised and sold. Beautiful antiques that would bring good money to help settle Dad's final expenses. But as I sat in his kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like his, surrounded by the ordinary objects of his daily life, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment in front of the Whitmore mirror. The feeling that something had been watching me from within the reflection. Something that belonged to shadows and old stories and the accumulated weight of too many deaths in front of the same piece of glass. I didn't sleep well that night in my own bed back in Des Moines. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw fragments of reflected light dancing across unfamiliar surfaces, heard whispers that might have been wind through old window frames or something else entirely. By 6 in the morning, I'd given up on rest and was sitting at my kitchen table with strong coffee and Dad's research folders, which I'd brought home despite my better judgment. The morning light made everything seem more manageable. Dad's meticulous documentation revealed the mind of a man trying to make sense of disturbing patterns, not the ravings of someone losing touch with reality. His handwriting remained steady throughout the files, the same careful script he'd used for 43 years of grain elevator paperwork. If this was dementia, it was the most organized and methodical dementia I'd ever encountered. I called my office and told my assistant I'd need the rest of the week to handle family matters. Marion understood. She'd lost her own father 2 years earlier and knew how death created endless bureaucratic obligations that somehow felt more exhausting than grief itself. Then I drove back to Fairfield, telling myself I was being practical about settling Dad's estate, though honesty would have forced me to admit I was seeking answers to questions I couldn't yet articulate. My first stop was the Fairfield Public Library, where Mrs. Chen had worked the reference desk for 37 years and knew the location of every local history file, newspaper archive, and genealogy record in 3 counties. She remembered me from high school research projects and offered her condolences with the gentle efficiency of someone who'd helped half the town trace their family histories. "I'm trying to understand some antiques my father collected," I explained, showing her Dad's list of mirror provenances. He was very thorough about researching their backgrounds, and I want to make sure his documentation is accurate before we sell the collection. Mrs. Chen's expression grew thoughtful as she reviewed Dad's notes. "Your father was in here regularly these past 2 years," she said. "Very dedicated researcher. He was particularly interested in estate sales and family histories connected to certain pieces, said he wanted to understand the full story behind each mirror before he displayed it in his collection." She led me to the microfilm readers and helped me locate newspaper archives dating back to the 1920s. Dad's research proved remarkably accurate. The Whitmore deaths were documented exactly as he'd recorded, along with several other families whose mirrors had found their way into his collection. The Harrison family had owned a large vanity mirror now hanging in Dad's guest room. 3 family members had died of heart failure over a 40-year span, each found seated at the same vanity. The Kierner family had sold a set of matching hand mirrors after their youngest daughter began sleepwalking and was repeatedly found standing in front of them at all hours of the night. "These are just coincidences," I murmured to Mrs. Chen as I scrolled through another obituary. "Families have genetic predispositions to certain health problems. People die of natural causes. There's nothing supernatural about any of this." She nodded diplomatically, but her expression suggested she'd encountered similar research requests before. "Your father seemed very concerned about something beyond the historical value," she said carefully. "The last time he was here, about 3 months ago, he asked me about methods for disposing of potentially dangerous antiques. Not financially dangerous, but otherwise." That information sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the library's aggressive air conditioning. Dad had been researching how to get rid of his collection, not expand it. The man who'd spent 2 years lovingly acquiring and arranging these pieces had reached a point where he wanted them gone, and he'd been serious enough about it to seek professional advice. After leaving the library, I drove to Benson's Antiques on the town square, where Dad had purchased several of his mirrors. Frank Benson had run the shop for 42 years and knew the provenance of every significant piece that had passed through Fairfield's small antique community. His weathered face lit up when I mentioned Dad's collection. "Harold was one of my best customers," Frank said, guiding me past displays of Depression glass and vintage furniture. "Had a real eye for quality pieces, especially mirrors. Never haggled over prices if he wanted something. Said beautiful objects were worth what they cost. No more and no less." But Frank's expression grew more subdued when I asked about Dad's recent visits. "Last few months he seemed troubled," the old dealer admitted. Started asking strange questions about the pieces he'd bought. Wanted to know if I'd had any problems with them, if other customers had ever complained about anything unusual. Even asked if I'd consider taking some of them back, which wasn't like Harold at all. Frank showed me his sales records for Dad's purchases, and I was struck by the pattern that emerged. Most of the mirrors had come from estate sales, often from families eager to dispose of them quickly. The prices were consistently lower than comparable pieces, as if the sellers were more interested in removal than profit. Several items had been returned to Frank by previous customers before Dad purchased them, always for vague reasons about not being right for the space or creating an uncomfortable atmosphere. People get funny ideas about antiques sometimes, Frank explained, though his tone suggested he'd encountered enough unexplained returns to wonder about those funny ideas himself. Mirrors, especially. Something about seeing your own reflection in glass that belonged to strangers, in rooms where other people lived and died, makes some folks uncomfortable, even if they can't say why. I spent the afternoon visiting other antique shops in the area, following the trail of Dad's purchases. The pattern held consistent: mirrors from estate sales, previous returns, sellers eager to move the pieces along. At Henderson's estate services, the woman who handled most of the sales Dad had attended pulled up her computer records and shook her head sympathetically. "Your father was a lovely man, but he had particular tastes that sometimes concerned me," she said. "He was drawn to pieces with complicated histories. Mirrors that had been in families for generations, often from homes where there had been tragedies or unusual circumstances. I tried to steer him toward prettier pieces without such heavy backgrounds, but he seemed specifically interested in the ones with stories." She showed me photographs from several estate sales Dad had attended, and I recognized many of the mirrors now hanging in his guest room. In each photo, the pieces looked beautiful, but somehow isolated, separated from other items as if the family had been eager to see them go. By evening, I had accumulated enough information to understand Dad's growing anxiety about his collection. Whether or not anything supernatural was involved, the mirrors clearly carried emotional weight from their previous owners, stories of loss, tragedy, and fear that had followed them from home to home. For a man grieving his wife's death and facing his own mortality, surrounding himself with objects connected to other people's deaths might have created a psychological burden he hadn't anticipated. But understanding the rational explanation didn't ease the growing unease in my own chest. As I drove back to Dad's house to spend another night reviewing his research, I found myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently than usual, though I couldn't say what I was looking for. The rational part of my mind insisted I was succumbing to suggestion, letting Dad's obsessions influence my own perceptions. Still, when I parked in Dad's driveway and looked up at the guest room window, I could swear I saw a brief flicker of light in the darkness behind the glass, movement that suggested someone was up there among the mirrors, though I knew the house was empty and I held the only key. That second night in Dad's house, I made the mistake of reading his personal journal, a leather-bound notebook I'd found tucked beneath his research folders. The entries began 2 years ago, with enthusiasm about his new collecting hobby, but the tone shifted dramatically over time, chronicling a transformation from joy to growing concern to something approaching terror. March 15th, found a beautiful Victorian vanity mirror at the Morrison estate sale. The granddaughter seemed almost relieved to see it go, said her grandmother, always claimed it showed things that weren't there. Probably just the poor woman's failing eyesight, but the mirror is exquisite. Linda would have loved the craftsmanship. June 3rd, strange experience this morning. Was shaving in the bathroom and thought I saw movement in the new mirror's reflection. Someone walking past the bedroom doorway. But when I turned to look, the hallway was empty. Need to check if the house is settling differently. Maybe the floor joists are shifting. September 22nd. Can't shake the feeling that the mirrors are watching me. Ridiculous thought, but there it is. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, always in the reflections, never in the actual room. Patricia thinks I need to get out more. Maybe she's right. The entries continued chronologically, documenting Dad's growing awareness that something was wrong with his collection. He'd begun experimenting with the mirror's placement, noting which combinations seemed to create the most disturbance. Certain pieces, when positioned facing each other, created what he called corridors of reflection that made him deeply uncomfortable. Others seemed to affect his sleep when placed in direct line of sight with his bedroom. January 8th. Covered the Whitmore mirror last night after dreaming about Margaret Whitmore again. In the dream, she was trying to tell me something important, but her voice was muffled as if she were speaking through water. When I woke up, I could swear I heard crying coming from the guest room. Found nothing, of course, but the sound was so clear. February 14th, Valentine's Day. Linda's favorite holiday. Spent the morning talking to her about the mirrors, telling her about my concerns. No, it sounds crazy, but I feel like she's trying to warn me about something. The mirrors aren't just collecting light and images. They're collecting something else, something that doesn't belong in our world. Reading Dad's private thoughts, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. His journal revealed a man trying desperately to maintain his sanity while experiencing phenomena he couldn't explain or dismiss. The writing remained coherent throughout, showing no signs of the confusion or disorientation typically associated with dementia. If anything, his observations became more detailed and methodical over time. I carried the journal upstairs to the guest room, where I'd decided to spend the night among the mirrors. If Dad's experiences were genuine, I needed to understand what he'd encountered. If they were products of an aging mind struggling with grief and isolation, spending time in the space might help me process my own feelings about his death and find peace with his final months. The room felt different at night. Moonlight streaming through the window created a complex web of reflected illumination that turned the space into something ethereal and strange. I'd brought a camping chair from the basement and positioned it in the center of the room, surrounded by the collection but not directly facing any single mirror. Dad's journal lay open in my lap, his careful handwriting visible in the dim light. For the first hour, nothing happened. The house settled with its familiar creaks and sighs, the heating system cycling on and off with mechanical regularity. I began to relax, convinced that Dad's experiences had been products of suggestion and grief rather than anything genuinely supernatural. The mirrors reflected moonlight and shadows in perfectly natural ways, creating beauty without menace. But as the night deepened, subtle changes began to occur. The reflected light seemed to shift independently of the moon's position, creating patterns that didn't quite match the actual shadows in the room. I found myself tracking movement in my peripheral vision, brief glimpses that vanished when I turned my head directly toward them. Nothing dramatic or clearly supernatural, just impressions of motion that kept my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m, I heard what sounded like whispered conversation coming from somewhere within the room. The voices were too soft to understand, layered and echoing as if multiple people were speaking at once from a great distance. I sat perfectly still, trying to locate the source. But the whispers seemed to emanate from the mirrors themselves, not from behind them, but from within the reflected surfaces. I approached the Whitmore mirror, the one Dad had covered most frequently in his final months. The gilt frame felt cold under my fingers, colder than the room's temperature should have allowed. In its darkened surface, my reflection looked pale and distorted, but there was something else. Shadows that moved independently of my own movements, shapes that suggested other people standing just beyond the mirror's edge. The rational part of my mind insisted I was experiencing pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and faces in random visual information. The stress of Dad's death combined with suggestive research and sleep deprivation was creating false perceptions, making me see meaning in meaningless shadows and hear voices in ordinary house sounds. But as I stood there studying my reflection, one of the shadows moved clearly into view. The figure of a woman in period dress, her face contorted with fear or warning. She appeared to be speaking urgently, her mouth moving in silent words I couldn't understand. Behind her, other figures began to emerge from the mirror's depths, all of them trying to communicate something desperate and important. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair and sending Dad's journal clattering to the floor. When I looked at the mirror again, it showed only my own frightened face reflected in ordinary glass. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the sound of my own rapid breathing and the house's familiar nighttime sounds. But I was no longer alone in understanding Dad's final months of anxiety. The mirrors weren't simply beautiful antiques with tragic histories. They were something more complex and disturbing, something that retained impressions of their previous owners in ways that defied rational explanation. Dad hadn't been losing his mind. He'd been discovering that his beloved collection came with spiritual baggage he'd never anticipated. I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to process what I'd experienced. By morning, doubt had crept back in. The human mind was capable of extraordinary self-deception, especially under emotional stress. I could have dreamed the entire encounter, or my subconscious could have created the experience based on Dad's research and journal entries. But when I returned to the guest room in daylight to retrieve Dad's journal, I found something that shook my rational explanations. The pages were open to an entry I hadn't read the night before, dated just 3 days before Dad's death. Bobby will come for the mirrors after I'm gone. He'll try to understand with his accountant's mind, looking for logical explanations. But some truths can't be balanced like a ledger. The mirrors hold more than reflections. They hold souls. Margaret Whitmore is still there, still trying to warn people. Linda visits sometimes too, trying to help me understand. When Bobby sees them, he'll know I wasn't crazy. He'll know the collection needs to end with our family. I'd read every page of the journal the night before. This entry hadn't been there, written in Dad's careful handwriting with ink that looked decades old, yet somehow fresh. Either I'd missed it in the dim light or something beyond my understanding had made sure I'd find it when I was ready to believe. The morning after finding Dad's impossible journal entry, I drove straight to Patricia's house in Cedar Rapids, arriving before she'd finished her breakfast coffee. She lived in a modest ranch-style home filled with the comfortable clutter of someone who'd spent decades caring for other people. Medical textbooks, family photos, grandchildren's artwork covering her refrigerator. The normalcy of her kitchen felt like a lifeline after the disorienting night among Dad's mirrors. "You look terrible, Robert," she said, pouring me coffee without being asked. "Are you sleeping? I know Dad's death has been hard on you, but you can't let grief make you sick." I'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive, trying to find words that wouldn't make me sound like I'd lost my mind. But sitting across from my practical, medical professional sister, the events of the past few days felt increasingly surreal. How could I explain shadows that moved independently in mirrors, voices that whispered from reflected surfaces, journal entries that appeared overnight in Dad's careful handwriting? "Patricia, I need to ask you something about Dad's final months," I began carefully. "When you visited him, did you ever notice anything unusual about his mirror collection? Anything that might have justified his concerns?" Her expression shifted to the patient tolerance she'd perfected during her nursing career. "Robert, we've been through this. Dad was showing early signs of dementia. The fixation on mirrors was a symptom, not a rational concern. I've seen it before. Elderly patients develop obsessions with objects or ideas that seem meaningful to them but don't reflect reality. But what if his concerns were based on actual experiences?" I pressed. "What if the mirrors really were causing disturbances that we dismissed because they didn't fit our medical understanding?" Patricia set down her coffee cup with the deliberate control of someone trying to remain patient. "Are you listening to yourself? You're talking about supernatural mirrors like we're living in a ghost story. Dad was a wonderful man, but his mind was deteriorating. The kindest thing we can do is sell his collection to people who will appreciate the pieces for what they actually are, beautiful antiques." I pulled out Dad's journal and showed her the entries documenting his experiences. She read them with the clinical attention she'd given thousands of medical charts, her expression growing more concerned as she turned the pages. "This is heartbreaking," she said finally. "You can see his mental state declining through the writing. The paranoid ideation, the auditory hallucinations, the fixation on objects that seem to have supernatural properties. It's textbook progression of dementia with psychotic features." "Then explain this," I said, showing her the final entry, the one that had appeared after Dad's death. Patricia examined the page closely, comparing the handwriting to earlier entries. Her medical training made her methodical, logical, resistant to supernatural explanations, but I watched her confidence waver as she studied the impossible entry. "You wrote this," she said finally. "You're so invested in Dad's delusions that you're continuing them yourself. This is grief manifesting in unhealthy ways, Robert. You need to see someone, a counselor or therapist who can help you process Dad's death without adopting his mental illness." Her words stung because part of me agreed with her assessment. The rational part of my mind insisted that grief and suggestion were creating false experiences, that I was seeing patterns where none existed. But the memory of shadows moving in mirrors, of whispered voices trying to convey urgent warnings, felt too vivid and specific to dismiss as imagination. "Come with me to Dad's house," I said. "Spend one night in the room with the mirrors. If nothing happens, I'll agree to immediate counseling and we'll sell the collection as planned. But if you experience even a fraction of what I did, then we need to consider that Dad's concerns were legitimate." Patricia's professional composure cracked slightly. I'm not going to enable your psychological break by participating in supernatural nonsense. The mirrors are going to estate sale next week, and that's final. Dad would want us to handle his affairs rationally, not indulge in fantasy. But something in her voice suggested less certainty than her words conveyed. She'd been a hospice nurse for over 2 decades, had sat with hundreds of dying patients, and heard countless stories about deathbed visions and unexplained phenomena. Her medical training taught her to dismiss such reports as products of medication and oxygen deprivation, but her experience had shown her that some mysteries defied clinical explanation. I spent the rest of the morning at Patricia's kitchen table, showing her dad's research about the mirror's previous owners. She approached the information with professional skepticism, but I watched her expression change as she read about the pattern of deaths and disturbances connected to each piece. These are just coincidences, she insisted, tragic coincidences that Dad interpreted through the lens of deteriorating mental health. People die, Robert. Families experience losses. Finding patterns in random events is a common symptom of paranoid thinking. Then why did estate sale companies keep getting these particular mirrors returned? I asked. Why were families consistently eager to sell them below market value? Why did Dad's research turn up similar stories from completely unconnected sources? Patricia remained silent for a long moment, studying the documentation with the same careful attention she gave medical charts. Finally, she looked up with an expression I recognized from childhood, the look she got when she was trying to protect me from something she didn't fully understand herself. Even if there's something unusual about the mirrors, she said slowly, that doesn't mean we should risk our own mental health by engaging with whatever Dad thought he experienced. The safest course is still to sell the collection and move on with our lives. But what if moving them to other families just spreads whatever problem Dad discovered? I argued. What if we have a responsibility to understand what we're dealing with before we pass it along? That question hung between us like a challenge neither of us wanted to accept. Patricia's medical ethics demanded that she consider the potential harm to future owners, while my accountant's training insisted on understanding all aspects of an asset before disposing of it. We were approaching the same conclusion from different directions, that we needed more information before we could responsibly handle Dad's collection. One night, Patricia said finally. I'll spend one night in that room, but only to prove that you're experiencing grief-induced hallucinations. When nothing happens, you're going to get professional help, and we're going to sell those mirrors immediately. Her agreement felt like both victory and defeat. I wanted her to experience what I had, to validate Dad's concerns and confirm that his final months hadn't been products of a deteriorating mind. But I also feared for her safety, worried that exposure to whatever haunted Dad's collection might harm the last family member I had left. We agreed to meet at Dad's house the following evening. Patricia would bring her medical bag and a rational perspective, while I would bring Dad's research and a growing certainty that we were about to confront something beyond our understanding. The mirrors had been patient for decades, collecting stories and souls behind their silvered surfaces. Tomorrow night, they would finally have the opportunity to share their accumulated secrets with Harold Mitchell's children. As I drove home to Des Moines, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see unfamiliar faces reflected in the glass. The rational part of my mind insisted this was paranoid behavior, but a deeper instinct warned me that some reflections were best left unexamined. Patricia arrived at Dad's house precisely at 7 o'clock, carrying her medical bag and wearing the determined expression of someone prepared to debunk supernatural nonsense through professional competence. She'd changed from her usual casual clothes into scrubs, as if the medical uniform would provide protection against whatever psychological contagion she believed I'd contracted from Dad's collection. Before we go upstairs, she said, setting her bag on Dad's kitchen table, I want you to understand what we're really doing here. I'm humoring your grief-induced delusions so you'll accept psychiatric help afterward. When nothing supernatural happens tonight, you're going to admit you need counseling. I nodded, though my stomach churned with anxiety about what she was about to experience. The past week had taught me that Dad's mirrors weren't simply beautiful antiques with tragic histories. They were active repositories of spiritual energy that responded to human presence in ways that defied medical explanation. Patricia's clinical skepticism might protect her initially, but the mirrors had decades of accumulated power behind their silvered surfaces. We climbed the stairs together, Patricia's practical nursing shoes clicking against the hardwood steps with mechanical regularity. The guest room door stood closed, but even from the hallway I could sense the presence waiting behind it, not malevolent exactly, but intensely aware of our approach. Dad's journal had taught me that the mirrors were inhabited by the spirits of their previous owners, souls trapped in reflected surfaces who'd been trying to communicate their distress for decades. The collection has grown since I was last up here, Patricia observed as I opened the door. Her voice carried forced casualness, but I noticed her step hesitate at the threshold. The room's atmosphere had intensified over the past week, as if our attention had somehow fed the mirror's supernatural properties. Every surface gleamed with reflected moonlight, creating a complex web of illumination that made the space feel larger and more alive than its actual dimensions. Dad arranged them specifically, I explained, showing her his detailed diagrams of mirror placement. He discovered that certain combinations created what he called resonance zones, areas where spiritual activity was most intense. The Whitmore mirror anchors the whole collection. Patricia approached the ornate oval mirror with clinical detachment, examining its gilt frame and aged silvering with professional interest. "It's certainly beautiful," she admitted. "I can understand why Dad was drawn to pieces like this. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." But as she studied her reflection in the antique glass, her expression began to change. The confident medical professional gradually gave way to someone recognizing phenomena beyond her training. Her reflection looked normal enough, but the mirror's darkened corners showed movement that didn't correspond to anything in the actual room. "That's unusual," she said softly, leaning closer to the glass. "There appears to be some kind of visual distortion in the peripheral areas, probably due to age-related deterioration of the silvering." I watched her struggle to maintain clinical objectivity as shadows began moving more distinctly in the mirror's depths. The spirits Dad had documented were responding to Patricia's presence, emerging from whatever dimension they inhabited to attempt communication with the living world. Margaret Whitmore appeared first, her period dress and desperate expression exactly as Dad had described in his journal entries. "Patricia," I said quietly, "look at the woman in the Victorian dress. She's trying to tell you something." My sister's medical training warred with the evidence of her own senses as Margaret Whitmore's spirit became more distinct in the reflection. Other figures joined her: Catherine Whitmore Collins, Elizabeth Collins Morrison, all the women who died in front of this same mirror over the decades. Their mouths moved in silent urgency, trying to convey warnings that transcended the boundary between life and death. "This is impossible," Patricia whispered, but her voice carried wonder rather than denial. "I can see them clearly. Multiple figures, all appearing to be women from different time periods. They're attempting to communicate, showing signs of extreme distress." The whispered voices began then, layered conversations in multiple languages and accents, all carrying the same desperate tone of warning. Patricia's clinical detachment crumbled as she recognized phenomena that no medical textbook could explain. The mirrors weren't simply reflecting light. They were reflecting souls, decades of accumulated spiritual energy trapped behind silvered glass. "They're trying to warn us," I said, approaching the mirror despite every instinct telling me to retreat. Dad figured out that the mirrors don't just hold reflections. They hold the essence of people who died while looking into them. Strong emotions at the moment of death somehow bind the soul to the reflective surface. Patricia backed away from the Whitmore mirror, her face pale with shock and growing understanding. "The pattern of deaths in Dad's research," she said. "All those people found dead in front of mirrors, all with expressions of terror. They weren't just dying, they were being trapped." The other mirrors in the room began responding to our presence, each one revealing its own collection of trapped spirits. The Victorian vanity mirror showed the Harrison family members who died of heart failure, their faces twisted with the sudden realization that their souls were being pulled into the glass. The Art Deco piece revealed a jazz-age couple locked in eternal argument, their mouths moving in silent recrimination. "Dad spent 2 years unknowingly collecting a spiritual prison," I continued, my voice steady despite the supernatural chaos surrounding us. "Every mirror contains the souls of people who died while looking into it. They've been trying to escape, to warn living people about the danger, but no one could see them until Dad developed the sensitivity." Patricia's medical mind struggled to process the impossible evidence before her eyes. "The dementia diagnosis," she said slowly. "Dad wasn't hallucinating. He was seeing actual spiritual phenomena that we dismissed because it didn't fit our scientific understanding. The trapped souls grew more agitated as we talked, their desperate attempts at communication becoming more frantic. Margaret Whitmore pressed against the inner surface of her mirror like someone trapped underwater, her mouth forming words we couldn't hear but could somehow understand. Don't let others die. Break the cycle. Free us from this prison. They want us to destroy the mirrors, I realized. That's what Dad was trying to figure out in his final months. He knew the collection was dangerous, but he didn't know how to safely dispose of pieces that contained human souls. Patricia approached another mirror, one of Dad's more recent acquisitions, showing a middle-aged man in 1940s clothing. His spirit gestured frantically toward something beyond our vision, trying to communicate information about the nature of his imprisonment and the mechanism that had trapped him in the glass. This changes everything, Patricia said, her nurse's training finally adapting to accommodate supernatural reality. If these mirrors are spiritual traps, then selling them to unsuspecting buyers would be unconscionably dangerous. We'd be passing along instruments of death disguised as beautiful antiques. The weight of responsibility settled on both of us as we understood the true nature of Dad's collection. We weren't just inheriting valuable mirrors. We were becoming guardians of dozens of trapped souls and protectors of future victims who might unknowingly purchase these deadly antiques. The spirit's desperate warnings made the stakes clear: destroy the mirrors and free the trapped souls, or risk decades more deaths as the collection continued claiming victims. Dad tried to find a solution, I said, showing Patricia his final research into methods of spiritual cleansing and mirror destruction. But he died before he could implement any of his plans. The responsibility passes to us now. Patricia nodded grimly, her medical ethics adapting to encompass supernatural obligations. The mirrors had revealed their deadly secret, and we were the only people who knew the truth about their dangerous nature. Tomorrow, we would need to find a way to safely destroy Dad's collection and free the souls that had been trapped for decades behind silvered glass. The morning brought no relief from the supernatural revelations of the previous night. Patricia had remained awake until dawn, documenting every detail of our encounter with clinical precision, as if creating medical records for patients who had died decades ago. Her nursing training demanded thorough documentation, even when the phenomena being recorded defied everything she'd learned about life, death, and the nature of human consciousness. We need professional help, she said over coffee in Dad's kitchen, her voice hoarse from hours of whispered conversation with trapped spirits. But not psychiatric help, spiritual help. We're dealing with something beyond medical science, beyond anything I've encountered in 23 years of hospice work. I had already begun researching specialists in supernatural phenomena, though finding credible experts proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. Most online resources led to obvious charlatans or New Age practitioners whose credentials seemed dubious at best. But Dad's meticulous research had included contact information for Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of religious studies at the University of Iowa, who specialized in death customs and spiritual manifestations across cultures. Dr. Vasquez arrived at the farmhouse that afternoon, bringing with her an air of academic authority that somehow made the supernatural situation feel more manageable. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes that suggested she'd encountered mysteries beyond conventional academic study. Her initial skepticism melted away within minutes of entering Dad's mirror room. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, approaching the Whitmore mirror with the reverence of a scholar discovering an unprecedented historical artifact. "I've studied reports of spiritual imprisonment in reflective surfaces, but I've never encountered such a concentrated collection. Your father appears to have unknowingly assembled one of the most significant supernatural phenomena in modern American history." Dr. Vasquez spent hours documenting the spirits trapped in each mirror, using equipment that measured electromagnetic fluctuations and temperature variations around the collection. Her instruments confirmed what our eyes had witnessed. The mirrors were generating energy signatures consistent with conscious spiritual activity. The trapped souls weren't products of imagination or grief-induced hallucination. They were measurable, documented entities with distinct electromagnetic signatures. "The mechanism appears to be emotional resonance at the moment of death," Dr. Vasquez explained as she studied her readings. "When someone dies while experiencing intense emotion, fear, regret, unfinished business, their spiritual energy can become bound to reflective surfaces they're focused on. Over time, the mirrors accumulate layers of trapped consciousness, creating what essentially amounts to a spiritual prison. Patricia watched the professor work with the fascination of someone discovering an entirely new field of study. "Is there a way to free them?" she asked. "Some method of releasing the trapped souls without destroying the mirrors themselves?" Dr. Vasquez's expression grew somber. "The mirrors themselves have become the prison. The silvering process creates a reflective surface that acts like spiritual quicksand. Once a soul becomes trapped, the mirror's very structure holds them captive. The only reliable method of release is complete destruction of the reflective surface." The implications were staggering. Dad's collection represented not just valuable antiques but a spiritual crisis requiring immediate intervention. Every day the mirrors remained intact, the trapped souls suffered continued imprisonment, while the collection posed ongoing danger to anyone who might look into them during moments of intense emotion or vulnerability. "There's another complication," Dr. Vasquez continued, consulting her notes. "Mirrors with this level of spiritual saturation often become increasingly active over time. The trapped consciousness can begin influencing the physical world, creating poltergeist phenomena, or even attempting to possess living individuals who spend extended time in their presence." As if summoned by her words, the mirrors throughout the room began exhibiting heightened activity. Shadows moved more distinctly behind the glass, and the whispered voices grew loud enough to understand fragments of conversation. Margaret Whitmore's spirit pressed against her mirror's surface with desperate urgency, her mouth forming words that finally became audible. "More are coming. The mirrors are calling others. Break the cycle before it spreads." Patricia and I exchanged frightened glances as we realized the full scope of the danger. The collection wasn't just a static threat, it was actively growing stronger, potentially influencing other mirrors in the community or drawing additional souls into its supernatural prison. Dad's death had somehow intensified the spiritual activity, as if the mirrors were feeding on the grief and emotional turbulence surrounding his passing. "We need to destroy them immediately," I said, though the words felt like admitting defeat against Dad's beloved collection. "Tonight, before they become any stronger or claim additional victims." Dr. Vasquez nodded grimly. "I can guide you through a proper spiritual cleansing ritual, but the actual destruction needs to be complete and irreversible. Every fragment of reflective surface must be eliminated to ensure the trapped souls find release." We spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for what Dr. Vasquez called a spiritual liberation ritual. She brought sage for cleansing, salt for protective circles, and ceremonial tools from various religious traditions that acknowledged the reality of souls trapped between worlds. Patricia contacted the county fire department to arrange for safe disposal of the mirror fragments, explaining that we were dealing with potentially hazardous antiques that required special handling. As the sun set, we began the solemn process of freeing Dad's collection from its supernatural imprisonment. Dr. Vasquez led us in prayers from multiple faith traditions, acknowledging the trapped souls and promising them release from decades of spiritual captivity. One by one, we carefully removed each mirror from its display position, speaking directly to the spirits we could see behind the glass. "Margaret Whitmore," I said to the ornate oval mirror, "your family's suffering ends tonight. Your warnings have been heard, and others will be saved because of your sacrifice." The destruction itself was both heartbreaking and liberating. Each mirror shattered with sounds that seemed to echo beyond the physical realm. Not just breaking glass, but spiritual chains snapping after decades of imprisonment. As the reflective surfaces were destroyed, we could see the trapped souls dissolving into light, their expressions changing from desperate fear to profound relief as they finally found peace. Patricia wept as she helped destroy the beautiful antiques, mourning not just the loss of Dad's collection, but the decades of suffering we were finally ending. The mirrors had been prisons disguised as art, death traps masquerading as valuable antiques. Their destruction was necessary, but it felt like erasing the final remnant of Dad's passionate hobby. By midnight, every mirror had been shattered beyond repair, their fragments carefully contained for professional disposal. The guest room felt hollow and strange without the complex web of reflected light that had defined it for years. But the oppressive spiritual atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace that suggested the trapped souls had finally found their way to whatever realm awaited beyond physical death. Dr. Vasquez performed final measurements with her equipment, confirming that the electromagnetic disturbances had ceased and the room's spiritual activity had returned to normal background levels. The spiritual prison that Dad had unknowingly created was finally closed, its captive souls released after decades of supernatural suffering. The weeks following the mirror destruction brought an unexpected sense of peace to our family. Patricia and I had shared an experience that transcended normal sibling relationships. We'd become partners in protecting both the living and the dead from supernatural dangers most people couldn't even imagine. The weight of that shared responsibility created a bond between us that felt stronger than childhood connections or adult obligations. Dr. Vasquez helped us establish what she called a supernatural incident protocol for handling similar situations in the future. Her research had revealed that Dad's collection wasn't unique. Throughout American history, certain antiques had accumulated spiritual energy that made them dangerous to unsuspecting owners. We began documenting patterns of estate sales, tracking mirrors, and other reflective objects that showed concerning histories of previous owner deaths or unexplained returns. Your father's collection was unusual only in its concentration, Dr. Vasquez explained during one of our weekly meetings. Most spiritually active mirrors exist as isolated pieces scattered through antique shops and estate sales, but Harold somehow identified and gathered the most dangerous specimens, creating a supernatural crisis that required immediate intervention. Patricia had taken extended leave from her nursing job to help establish what we decided to call the Mitchell Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to identifying and safely disposing of dangerous supernatural antiques. Her medical background proved invaluable for investigating unexplained deaths that might be connected to spiritually active objects, while my accounting skills helped structure the Foundation's finances and legal framework. The Foundation's first case came from Mrs. Chen at the Fairfield Public Library, who remembered helping another family research the history of mirrors they'd inherited from a great-aunt's estate. The Hendricks family had experienced 3 deaths over 2 generations, all connected to an Art Nouveau vanity mirror that now sat in their spare bedroom. Patricia and I drove to their home in Burlington, bringing Dr. Vasquez and her electromagnetic detection equipment. The Hendricks mirror contained only 2 trapped spirits, the great-aunt who'd originally owned it and her sister who died while visiting decades earlier. But the spiritual imprisonment was just as real and dangerous as what we'd encountered in Dad's collection. The family had begun experiencing the same symptoms Dad had documented: whispered voices, movement in peripheral vision, growing anxiety around the antique piece. "We thought Grandma Ruth was trying to communicate with us," explained Janet Hendricks, a woman about Patricia's age who'd inherited the family home. She'd always loved that mirror, spent hours at the vanity getting ready for church or social events. When strange things started happening after we moved it to the guest room, we assumed she was trying to tell us something important. The destruction of the Hendricks mirror proved easier than dismantling Dad's entire collection, but the emotional impact remained profound. Grandma Ruth's spirit showed the same desperate relief we'd witnessed in Dad's room, her expression changing from fearful imprisonment to peaceful resolution as the reflective surface shattered and released her soul. These early cases taught us that spiritually active mirrors often attracted families with psychic sensitivity, people naturally able to perceive supernatural phenomena but lacking the knowledge to understand what they were experiencing. Dad had possessed this sensitivity without recognizing it, drawn to dangerous antiques by unconscious awareness of their spiritual activity. "The mirrors called to him," Dr. Vasquez observed after documenting our third case. "Harold's grief over your mother's death created an emotional vulnerability that made him susceptible to supernatural influence. The mirrors somehow recognized his sensitivity and drew him to collect them, concentrating spiritual energy until it reached crisis levels." Understanding Dad's collection in these terms helped Patricia and me process our guilt about dismissing his concerns as dementia. He hadn't been losing his mind. He'd been responding to genuine supernatural phenomena that his natural psychic abilities allowed him to perceive. Our rational scientific worldview had blinded us to the reality of his experiences. The Mitchell Foundation grew slowly but steadily, funded by donations from families we'd helped and grants from academic institutions studying paranormal phenomena. Dr. Vasquez connected us with researchers at universities across the Midwest who were documenting similar cases of spiritually active antiques causing unexplained deaths or psychological disturbances. By Christmas, 6 months after Dad's funeral, we'd handled 12 cases of supernatural mirror imprisonment and established protocols for safely identifying and destroying spiritually active antiques. The Foundation's reputation spread through academic networks and online communities dedicated to paranormal research, bringing us cases from across the region. Patricia had discovered a new calling in supernatural social work, applying her nursing skills to help families cope with paranormal experiences that medical professionals couldn't understand or treat. She developed counseling techniques for people who'd witnessed spiritual phenomena, helping them distinguish between genuine supernatural encounters and psychological symptoms that required medical intervention. "Dad would be proud," she said one evening as we reviewed Foundation case files in his old kitchen. He spent his final months trying to understand and solve a problem that could have killed other people. Now we're continuing his work, protecting families from dangers he identified but couldn't handle alone. I'd moved back to Fairfield permanently, selling my Des Moines accounting practice to focus full-time on Foundation work. The small town felt like home in ways it hadn't since childhood, partly because our work gave me a sense of purpose that regular business had never provided. We were preventing deaths, freeing trapped souls, and protecting families from supernatural dangers that conventional authorities couldn't even acknowledge. The farmhouse became Foundation headquarters, with Dad's guest room converted into an office for documenting cases and storing research materials. The space felt peaceful now, filled with purpose rather than supernatural menace. Sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when I worked alone, I felt Dad's presence in gentle ways, not trapped or desperate like the mirror spirits, but watchful and approving of how his children had transformed his final crisis into ongoing protection for other families. Mrs. Kowalski, now 92 and still living next door, often brought us cookies and coffee while we worked on case files. She'd been the first person to understand that Dad's concerns about mirrors were legitimate, and she took quiet pride in the Foundation's success. "Your father was always a problem solver," she told Patricia during one of these visits. "Even as a young man, he couldn't stand seeing people in trouble without trying to help. This work you're doing, it's exactly what Harold would have chosen if he'd lived long enough to figure out how to handle those cursed mirrors safely." The Foundation's work was just beginning, but it felt like a fitting memorial to Dad's memory. His accidental collection of supernatural dangers had become the foundation for protecting other families from similar threats. The mirrors that had nearly destroyed our family's peace were now helping us save lives and free trapped souls across the Midwest. 2 years after Dad's funeral, I stood in the Fairfield Methodist Church during their annual memorial service, listening to Reverend Matthews read the names of congregation members who'd passed away. When he reached Harold Mitchell, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, but it was accompanied now by something else. Pride in how Dad's final struggle had transformed into ongoing service to others. The Mitchell Foundation had grown beyond anything Patricia and I had initially imagined. Our nonprofit now employed 3 full-time researchers, maintained relationships with universities in 7 states, and had successfully resolved 43 cases of spiritually active antiques. Dr. Vasquez had published 2 academic papers on our work, bringing scholarly credibility to investigations that might otherwise be dismissed as paranormal nonsense. More importantly, we'd prevented an estimated 12 deaths based on families who contacted us after experiencing early warning signs Dad had documented: whispered voices, movement in reflections, growing anxiety around inherited mirrors. The Foundation's early intervention protocols allowed us to identify and safely destroy dangerous antiques before they could claim additional victims. The work had changed both Patricia and me in fundamental ways. She'd developed what Dr. Vasquez called enhanced spiritual sensitivity, the ability to recognize supernatural phenomena that most people couldn't perceive. This gift made her invaluable for case investigations, but it also meant she lived with constant awareness of spiritual activity that existed just beyond normal human perception. "Sometimes I see them in ordinary mirrors now," she'd confided to me recently. "Not trapped souls, but echoes of people who use the mirrors regularly. Faint impressions that fade quickly, like photographs that haven't quite developed. It's not frightening, just different from how I used to see the world." My own sensitivity had developed differently, manifesting as intuitive understanding of which antiques carried spiritual weight and which were simply old objects. I could walk through estate sales and immediately identify pieces that felt heavy with accumulated emotional energy, though not all of them proved dangerous enough to require foundation intervention. The farmhouse had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for families dealing with supernatural phenomena. Our guest room, the same space where Dad had unknowingly assembled his dangerous collection, now served as a consultation area where people could describe their experiences without fear of medical dismissal or social ridicule. The irony wasn't lost on us that the room which had nearly destroyed our family's peace had become a place of healing and understanding for others. Mrs. Kowalski had passed away peacefully the previous spring, leaving us a handwritten note that we'd framed and hung in the foundation office. Harold would be so proud of his children. You turned his greatest fear into other families' salvation. That's the kind of love that outlasts death itself. The Foundation's reputation had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The Smithsonian's Folklife Division had contacted us about documenting American spiritual traditions connected to material objects. Several television producers had approached us about documentary projects, though we'd declined most media attention to protect the privacy of families we served. We're not paranormal investigators or ghost hunters, Patricia often explained to curious reporters. We're crisis counselors who happen to specialize in supernatural emergencies that conventional authorities can't handle. Our goal is resolution and healing, not entertainment. The work had also brought unexpected personal connections. I'd begun a tentative relationship with Dr. Sarah Coleman, a historian from the University of Iowa who'd collaborated with us on several cases involving 19th century spiritualist movements. She understood the demands of foundation work and didn't find it strange that my evenings were often spent researching the supernatural histories of innocent-looking antiques. Patricia had found similar understanding with James Wright, an Episcopal priest who'd sought our help when his congregation inherited a pipe organ with troubling spiritual associations. Their shared experience of ministry, his to the living, hers to both living and dead, created a bond that transcended normal romantic relationships. These connections felt like gifts Dad had somehow arranged, ways of ensuring his children wouldn't face the isolation he'd experienced during his final months of supernatural encounters. The foundation work was emotionally demanding, requiring us to witness spiritual suffering that most people couldn't even acknowledge. Having partners who understood the reality of our calling made the burden bearable. On quiet Sunday afternoons, I often sat in Dad's old recliner and thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. His death had initially seemed like simple tragedy, an elderly man's mind failing as his body wore out. But the truth had proved far more complex and meaningful. Dad's final months hadn't been products of dementia, but spiritual awakening that he'd faced alone, without family support or professional understanding. The mirrors he'd collected were gone, their trapped souls finally at peace. But the knowledge gained from that collection continued protecting families across the region. Dad's accidental assembly of supernatural dangers had become the Foundation's greatest educational resource, teaching us to recognize patterns that might otherwise claim additional victims. Sometimes, especially during Foundation board meetings held in his old kitchen, I felt Dad's presence in ways that transcended memory. Not supernatural visitation like the trapped mirror spirits, but the continuing influence of someone whose love for his family had motivated him to confront dangers beyond normal human experience. His research, his documentation, his desperate attempts to understand supernatural phenomena, all had become tools for helping others facing similar crises. The Foundation's mission statement, framed above Dad's old desk, captured what his legacy had become. Protecting families from supernatural dangers through education, intervention, and compassionate service to both the living and the deceased. It wasn't the retirement Dad had planned, but it honored the courage he'd shown during his final months of supernatural encounters. 2 years after his funeral, Harold Mitchell's children had transformed his greatest fear into ongoing protection for other families. The mirrors were gone, but the love that had motivated his desperate warnings lived on through work that prevented deaths and freed trapped souls. In ways he never could have imagined, Dad's final struggle with supernatural forces had become his most important gift to the world. Knowledge that saved lives and brought peace to spirits who'd waited decades for release. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about Harold Mitchell's supernatural legacy in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on your screen.